Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome. It is 4 p.m. ET, and you have found us here on Crime Time on A Mighty Blaze, and we are so pleased that you are here today. I'm your host, Hank Phillippi. I am the USA Today bestselling author of 13 going on 14 novels of suspense. My current book is Her Perfect Life, which I have on the door, this way, behind me, and my new book, The House Guest, which comes out in February, which is sort of Gaslight meets Thelma and Louise. So we'll talk about that when the time comes. But the time has come today to welcome the fabulous Elizabeth Brooks and her new book, The House in the Orchard, which really, prime timers, I cannot wait for you to hear about this book. I cannot wait to talk with Elizabeth about how her brain works to put this book together. It is evocative. It is atmospheric. It is so unusual and so completely immersive. I can tell you that it is a BuzzFeed, CrimeReads, Housekeeping. Good Housekeeping is a completely different entity. And Departures Magazine Best Book of Fall. Welcome, 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 Elizabeth. And you are coming to us from, you tell us where.
From the Isle of Man. So the Isle of Man is a little island in between England and Ireland. So I'm a good many miles away from you across the Atlantic Ocean.
Have you always lived there?
No, I grew up in England, in Chester. So I moved here about 20 years ago and feels like home now.
How do you, is it just, you just get there by a ferry? How do you get?
Ferry or plane. There's plenty of planes as well. And then there's a ferry a couple of times a day to Liverpool and one to Lancaster. So, yeah.
And forgive me, and I don't mean to do a travelogue, but I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by this. Is it isolated and gothic? Or is
it can be when it's when the weather is autumnal and wintry and there's a mist on the sea, then it can be quite gothic, but it's not really that sort of isolated. There's plenty of things going on and people around, and there's a population that's about 70,000, so it's not that abandoned. But,
well, I mean, I live in Newton, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And I think the population of Newton is about 70,000.
Right.
So just my little town. So I love to imagine where you live. It just sounds, it sounds so cool. Forgive me. But it really does.
It's a lovely place it's a lovely place to live and to write. Yeah.
Because, I mean, is there a good story of how you ended up there?
It was because I got married and my husband's job was out here. So I came with him and we started our family out here, and I started writing out here. So
you started writing there?
Well, pretty much. Well, I mean, I have always written, but I started writing properly, seriously, once I got out here. Yeah.
Did you look at it as an adventure? What was it?
I did, because I'd never been here before, even though it's not very far away. It's just, that little bit of an adventure to get out here on the boat or the plane. So I'd never actually visited until we were engaged and then married. So it was quite an adventure to come out here. Yeah, it was.
I think that's so exciting and so life-changing. And we are so pleased that you started writing, as you say, properly, because you wound up with The House in the Orchard. Mm-hmm. Welcome, welcome, welcome. When I look over here, you see that I am looking at the comments, and I see, oh my God, like Pamela Fry-Priest and Susie Baldwin and Renee and Sharon Carlson Person is here, and Shannon Hansen. Hooray. Look at all of you. It's absolutely wonderful. And we welcome you here today to talk about The House in the Orchard by Elizabeth Brooks. Elizabeth, I have to read you this blurb from Tasha Alexander, who is one of my favorites of all times. She says, Elizabeth Brooks has penned an inspired take on the Gothic novel that would impress Daphne du Maurier and Emily Bronte.
I'll take that.
Yeah. Alluring, atmospheric, and deliciously creepy, The House in the Orchard is a wickedly entertaining read. Now, that is quite the endorsement. What did you think when you read that?
No, I was really over the moon by that. Yes, it's, to be compared to Daphne du Maurier, who's a massive inspiration for me, is it's amazing, really. And it was really just whenever
you see that when someone we sit alone whether in Newton, Massachusetts, or on the Isle of Man, and we write this book that we hope is good. And we know that there are people who write in the same realm, in the same genre. And
Yeah.
then they're going to read it. And
Yeah.
there's that moment when you think, I wonder if this is good. So when you
Absolutely.
get this sort of stamp of approval from,
Oh, it means a lot. It really does, because it's such a, as you say, it's such a solitary thing, writing, isn't it? And you do it, and it's, to begin with, it's just for yourself, and it's just you're following your own ideas and your what you want to read and what you want to tell. And then there comes that point where you think, well, gosh, it's it's got to go. Someone else is going to read it, and and you sort of start questioning yourself then, and questioning whether it works, and whether other people will see it in the same light as you. And yeah, as you say, when an endorsement like that comes through, it means a great deal.
I was just listening to an interview with Anthony Horowitz, who is one of my favorite authors. And he was saying that when he writes his books, he's very enthusiastic during the writing of the book. Oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be wonderful. And then the minute he hands it in, he's just overwhelmed with the doubt of, oh my golly, everyone's going to hate this. This is bad. Why did I do this? Do you have a doubt moment when you're writing?
That resonates with me very much. Yes, when you're in the throes of it and you're in the middle of it, it feels like the most unusual and original and amazing thing that's ever been written. And and then it's when you finish it and when you hand it over to someone else, the doubts really set in, and you just start. I don't know. You just start thinking about just seeing faults everywhere. I think when you read it over, that's when you sort of have thought that it's finished, and then you read it over, and everything that's not good just pops out at you and seems to really just stand out.
Yeah. It's the panic of the send button. You hit send, and suddenly it's as if everything that's bad about your book is just highlighted in yellow. Yeah. When I sent in my last book, someone said to me, "Is it good?" And I said, "Well, it's the best thing I've ever written, or it's terrible. I have to see what my editor says."
Yes, because you lose all sense of,
but only a writer could think that way, because it's the same book, but depending on what someone else thinks, it's good or bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I try not to read too many reviews, or not go on Goodreads or Amazon, because you're either over the moon because somebody said something lovely, or you're absolutely in the pits of despair because someone's given it 1 star. And I think you just have to step back, and it'll drive you mad.
Margaret in the back room is calling it Schrodinger's manuscript. That's exactly right. It could be alive or dead. We don't know. At the same time. And that's exactly how I feel about it. Let me take 1 minute to welcome you all again to Crime Time on A Mighty Blaze. If you have not been here before, oh boy, this is great. We are going to be talking about The House in the Orchard by Elizabeth Brooks. So you have picked a marvelous time to join us. If you are a Crime Time veteran, you are in for a treat. As you know, Crime Time was started a little over 2 years ago by the fabulous powerhouse team of Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt to keep us talking about books and keep us discovering new books and new authors, to keep our community together. And we are going strong. And this is my episode number, I don't even know how many. And we are welcoming today Elizabeth Brooks. And let me quickly tell you about Elizabeth Brooks. She is the author of The Orphan of Salt Winds and The Whispering House. She grew up in Chester, England, and graduated from Cambridge University, and now, as she said, resides on the Isle of Man with her husband and 2 children. And she is giving away, and Tin House, their publisher, is giving away a copy of The House in the Orchard. Hold up, Elizabeth, the hardcover, so they can see what they're going to get. I have the advanced copy, but you have, look at that.
Yes, beautiful cover.
Beautiful cover and beautiful inside. I would love to hear you describe this book. I would love to hear, if you will, tell us a little bit about this book.
Well, it's a historical piece of work, which I love writing, and I love researching and writing in the Victorian period. So it's my Victorian Gothic, if you like. There's a framing story set in the Second World War, or just after the Second World War, where a young woman, a young war widow, inherits a sort of rather creepy old Victorian house. And she discovers a child's diary, which she then begins to read. And we, as the reader, are sort of go along with her and read over her shoulder, if you like, this diary, which forms the main part of the novel, which is the diary of Maud Gower, who is a 13-year-old in 1876. And it tells the story of her sort of early teenage years when she's orphaned and she's sent to live with this mysterious Miss Greenaway, who has a reputation, shall we say, that Maud doesn't understand. She doesn't understand why everybody is suspicious or sort of maligning of Miss Greenaway. So she has to make up her mind what she thinks of this mysterious new guardian, and that's where the sort of mystery starts and the tragedy really sort of unfolds.
How did you decide on this? It's a multi-date structure with the real life being in 1945 and the diary being from 1876. How did you decide to reveal the story that way? It could have gone several ways.
Well, I started by just intending it to just be Maud's diary. That is sort of the bulk of the book. And I began by writing that. But when I finished Maud's story, I felt like it needed, because she's such an unreliable narrator, and it's the sort of one of the central questions is who is she and what does the diary mean? Is it authentic? Is it manipulative? I felt like it needed a framing story so that we could have somebody like Peggy, who is the protagonist of the framing story. We needed someone like her in order to take us with her, if you like, and question the book, sort of ask the questions that sort of naturally arise from it, really. So Peggy's story came second.
I mean, that's a wonderful idea, because the diary, I say, would have worked. A diary would have worked, but it's a different story to be reading someone's diary through someone else's point of view, because now she's assessing, she's deciding, she's asking questions in her own time. She could be doing research. And as you say, she's asking the questions or wondering about the things that we're wondering about, plus sort of the Greek chorus of the story that she gets to reiterate things that we might think. So I'm fascinated that you wrote Maud's whole diary first. So let's talk about that for a second, because the thing about a diary is that it's what we tell ourselves, and it's creating a reality. And do we think someone's going to read it? And if so, who and why? Or is it just for us? And if so, why would we do it? Talk a little bit about the philosophy of a diary and why that is potentially so revealing or not.
Yeah, well, I think that I suppose when I began, I was thinking of the diary as, in a way, the most straightforward, the most naive and revealing sort of form of writing that there is, in a way, because, as you say, you're writing it for yourself. It's a private thing. Why wouldn't you tell the truth and pour out, your deepest, darkest secrets? But then I suppose the more I wrote, the more I was thinking how I think even the most private diary, the diarist is imagining an audience. Even if they don't really imagine they will ever actually be read, you're still imagining some sort of sympathetic reader. Maybe in the future, maybe when you're dead and gone, maybe somebody uncovering it. And I think that made me sort of start to think about how a diary could actually be quite a sort of manipulative or persuasive sort of document, really. I was quite inspired by it. It's completely different book, but Gone Girl, the diary in that, where it seems such a straightforward and such a sort of naive thing, and of course it's completely turned on its head when you realize that the diary is meant to be discovered and meant to be consumed, and it's meant to alter the mind of the reader. So I suppose the more I wrote, the more of Maud's diary I wrote, the more I started thinking about those sort of questions, really.
Because a diary is sort of a performance. It can become a performance, and then you're creating a history and you're creating a script for yourself. And then the reality, the sheer reality that you go into it with, sort of morphs into something else that then you might believe.
I think that's right. Yes. I mean, I think if you're not intending some sort of audience, even if the audience is only yourself, even if you're only presenting yourself to yourself, if you're not doing that, why choose words? Why bother to take the time and effort to write it down on paper? So I think there is always going to be a sort of performative aspect to diary writing. Yes.
Exactly. And it's also sort of a reassurance to oneself that we exist, that something happened to us, that important things happened to us, and that we don't want to forget what happened to us.
And that those things have meaning as well. It sort of, you're giving your life a story, a shape, a structure. You're picking out the things that matter to you, that mean things to you, and turning your life. I mean, Maud is very much turning her life into a story, into a novel in a way, I suppose.
And even if, and especially in Maud's case particularly, and I don't want to give away too much of the story, but you can go a little bit. She's talking about things that she is struggling to understand, and she could be wrong about her assessments of them. Because, and then there's not only Maud writing the diary, and Peggy reading the diary, but then you write it. You, Elizabeth, writing the diary,
it's
and Peggy reading the diary. So it's such a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional chess game.
I know. Yes,
it was like to write that.
Started giving you a headache when you start thinking about how many layers there are. I know there's Maud, and then is Maud really who she says she is, and it's really me, and it gets complicated. But
well, that's lovely. That's what makes it great.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it makes it so enjoyable to write. But yes, I think a lot of what Maud is doing as a child is she doesn't understand. There's a lot about her life that she doesn't understand. There's a whole adult world that she's moving about in, and it's very mysterious, and there are things that are deliberately hidden from her. And a lot of her diary writing is her efforts to make some sense of all that, and to just sort of explore it all, I suppose, and try and come to some sort of conclusions about things, which she does with more or less success or not, as you know.
More or less success or not. And that's about all we're going to say about The House in the Orchard. Although, keeping talking about this, because there is so much more to talk about. Peggy, who finds the diary, and I love how you handled that she finds the diary and then just closes the desk for a minute. And I thought, open the diary, why? And of course she does eventually. And she comes to this through grief and through change. Talk a little bit about why that's who Peggy is, why she winds up in this same house and finds this diary, and what her life is at that moment.
Yeah. So Peggy she lives with her father-in-law, so her deceased husband's father, and also her small son Laurie, who's he's about 5, I think, in the beginning. And she has obviously quite her father-in-law Frank is Maud's brother, and he is he's quite a mysterious character in his own right, and he's quite a sort of straight-laced, quiet, upright, sort of upstanding sort of man, not terribly sympathetic. And I think Peggy, living with him, feels quite constrained and is eager to get away. So when she inherits this big rambling old country house, she's quite keen on the idea of moving out there, moving away from London with her small son, where he'll have lots of space to play and she'll be free of her rather constrictive father-in-law's presence. But when they go to view the house for the first time, Frank is very keen that Peggy doesn't move into it, and that because on the grounds that there's something wrong with the house, which he's not willing to explain. But Peggy is not sure whether he's just being manipulative and trying to keep her under his coercive control, if you like, or whether there really is something wrong with the house, and that's really where the diary takes her.
And the idea that there's something wrong with a house, let's discuss that for a minute, because what could be wrong with the house?
The house has seen a lot in its time, and I think I'm sort of playing with that Gothic house idea, I suppose, that all the things that the house has gone through, the things that have happened in its rooms, have left their mark, whether you want to call it a haunting exactly, or whether it's just that sort of sense that dark things have happened in this place and they've left some kind of imprint. I think that's a sort of question that keeps being asked throughout the book, I suppose, and Peggy has to grapple with whether she can live with the history of the house, what exactly the history of the house amounts to, and whether it really is a haunting. There is a sort of element of ghost story in the Peggy section of the book.
Certainly. I mean, just as in, all of us who love Daphne du Maurier and those sort of Gothic novels, I mean, talking about not going there are places that Peggy is told not to go,
Yes.
which raises the old red flag for all of us readers.
Yeah. I love the haunted house trope. It's just so rich, and I think it's just so interesting, that idea of the house as this receptacle of history, and also the idea of the house as a sort of two-way. Is it a protective place where you find your home, or is it a constricting place where you become trapped? And I think that's part of the dynamic, and that's very much the Daphne du Maurier sort of dynamic of Mandalay and all those other houses that she creates, and that sense of the past as a. I mean, Daphne du Maurier doesn't really go in for sort of ghosts as in, the literal sort of chain clanking ghosts, but she's very much into the haunting of the woman that was once Rebecca, who was once in the house and has left her mark there.
I mean, it's very relatable, because I think all of us have gone into places from time to time, and you open the door and you walk in and think, oh no, I'm not going, this is not good. And then you think, what could be not good? And other places are welcoming and loving and instantly immersively great. And the idea that there is this energy about some places is sort of undeniable. And whether it comes from the place or from within us.
Yes. I think that, I mean, it's not necessarily explicable, but it's definitely true. Just undeniable.
Not necessarily explicable, but definitely that is our mantra for today. How do you? I mean, let me just read you all something, just very, very briefly. This is part that takes place in 1945, and the diary from 1876, and you have this gorgeous parallel construction where things happen to Peggy and things happen to Maud, and it's subtle, but it's parallel. I'm just going to read a tiny little bit, you all. This is Peggy. She yawns and tosses the book aside, another book, and the cat makes no objection when it, I'm going to get my glasses so I don't have to strain to read this gorgeous thing. She yawns and tosses the book aside, and the cat makes no objection when she rubs it between the ears. Her eyes rest absently on the little desk while she sips her tea and eats her sandwich. When she's finished, she gets up, dusts the crumbs from her hands, and brings the diary back to bed. The cat waits until she's settled before it walks up her body to the pillow and peers under the covers. She lifts them up, and it slinks inside, its tail brushing her face as it makes its way down to her feet. Peggy opens the notebook and begins to read. The Private Diary of Maud Louise Gower, January 1876. Now this is the diary. It is cold without Ebenezer curled up in my lap. I wish Miss Wilson hadn't frightened him away. There's no fire in my bedroom and no color. I sit on a dark patterned rug in front of a dark empty hearth surrounded by dark wooden furniture. Ruth has draped all the mirrors in the house with black cloths, including the one on my dressing table, in case Pa's spirit gets trapped in the glass. Servants are such foolish and superstitious creatures, as Mamma is fond of observing. All the same, now that the light is fading, I'm glad I can't see into my mirror. Things that were quite normal last week have become dark and twisted this week. I mean, who is not going to read on when things that were quite normal last week are dark and twisted this week? For Maud and for Peggy. Mm-hmm. Both of them have cats. Both of them have these books. Both of them have this experience in the house. Did you just get chills when you can write something like that? I certainly did reading it.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's good. I did. Yes, I did. I mean, I did. I think especially in the Victorian sections, and thinking about the Victorian attitudes to death and grief, because I mean that part where you just read about Maud, the reason that things seem so different this week than they did last week is because her father's just died, and she's in that sort of state of shock where, you know, she's thinking this time last week he was here and now he's not, and it's just that total sort of life is just turned inside out feeling. And researching about the Victorians and their whole sort of attitude to death and how different it is to ours, it was really fascinating and quite chilling as well. Yes, all the sort of industry of mourning that they had, or the clothes that they wore, the way they covered the mirrors, as in that section there, and the superstitions and the sort of openness as well about death and mourning that perhaps we've lost, and the way that they sort of, it was very much part of their lives, I think, in the way that we...
Of course, people are calling me during this. Hold on a second. This is so ridiculous. We're all riveted to what you're saying about haunting and things that we don't understand. And then the phone rings.
It's all from the other world.
Exactly. It brings us right back into the present. But let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk about research, and I want to talk about language, and I want to talk about anachronisms. I want to talk about how you put yourself into those two worlds. I mean, even when I just read those two paragraphs, they're very differently written, but neither of them was written in 2022 or whenever you wrote this book. How do you make yourself have the voice and the feeling and the sensibility of someone in 1945 and differently in 1876?
I think it's mostly about sort of immersing yourself in books, and well, in terms of 1945, I suppose you can also immerse yourself in film and recordings as well, and just getting that feel for the way that people spoke and the way that people, you know, Victorian novels, the way they put their words together in them as well. And I think it's just a question of immersion, really. And certainly with Maud, I have been reading a lot of Victorian novels, and her voice very much sprung from them. And her voice was very strong, actually, in my mind. I mean, the very sort of initial spark for this novel was her and her voice. And I was in the middle of another completely different project at that point, but she was just springing up in my mind all the time. And I'd be jotting down little phrases that she wrote in her diary, and I'd have a notebook full of Maud things, even before it shaped itself into a novel, because her voice was so strong.
I'd love to hear more about that. How did that happen? And she just sort of appeared or knocked on the door?
It's really hard to just explain really how it happened. Whether I think I'd already thought I knew that I would like to write a Victorian Gothic at some point, because it's sort of been my favorite genre, and I've never quite done it before this one. So I had that in the back of my mind, and I think just the idea of writing from a child's point of view sprung up, and just her way of speaking just was so distinctive, and it just came to me really strongly. It was just the initial spark really that set the whole thing off.
I mean, a 13-year-old, who we think of as a child, is much more adult as a 13-year-old in Victorian times, and we would have a different vocabulary and a different language and a different way of looking at the world. Did you become her when you were writing this? Did she inhabit you? I don't mean to be woo-woo about this either.
Yeah.
You're an author and you just
but it does feel a bit like that. Yes, it is a bit like being inhabited by a different voice. Yes, and just that inhabiting that child's world, which, as you say, is quite a different thing from a 21st century child, but still, although she's got quite a sophisticated vocabulary and she doesn't write like you would expect a modern day 13-year-old to write, but she's still incredibly naive, probably a lot more naive than a contemporary child of the same age. And just getting in, just listening to her voice and getting inside her, or her getting inside me. I'm not sure which way around it was really, but yeah.
You know, I can feel that in reading it. We're talking about The House in the Orchard, if you have just joined us, by Elizabeth Brooks. Yes, I could feel that. I think when I was reading this, and there's this sort of aura, this sort of overlay of incipient heartbreak in it that, that you can just sort of feel her longing and her yearning and her need to understand the world around her. And then Peggy, who speaks like someone in 1945, you said she came second, and I think that's so interesting. So how did she emerge to you as the vehicle to be the reader of Maud's diary?
I think Peggy is much more of a straightforward character. I suppose she has a lot less airtime, so she doesn't get a chance to be quite as complex, if you like, as Maud. Maud is a complicated character. She's frustrating, she's lovable, she's annoying, she's snobbish, she's so many things. Whereas Peggy, I think, is a little bit more of a sort of every woman, if you like. She's totally understandable and sympathetic, and she's very concerned for her small son, and there's nothing sort of too prickly or difficult about Peggy. I suppose she was a little bit more easy to write in that sense.
Well, she comes across as much more sort of regular, normal person.
She's a grown up apart from anything else, and she's mature, and she's not got those sort of complications and immaturities that sort of beset Maud as a child.
We've all been 13, and we all know. Talk about that is when when young women especially start keeping a diary, because the world is just so fraught and full of angst, and we realize our place in the world. Departures magazine, and I know that Margaret in the back room has had this up earlier, said issues of class, grief, and longing rise up through the floorboards of every page, which is a multi-level quote, but we'll just skip right by the floorboards. Did you mean to talk about issues of class, grief, and longing?
I think they just came up naturally with Maud's voice, in a way. And in the terms of the place where Maud was coming from. Grief, her life is so shaped by grief. She, especially the loss of her father, who she's very close to, and then shortly after the beginning, the loss of her mother, who is a much more complicated relationship, if you like, and not so close, but still there's that sense of the sense that death is all around her, and that it's threatens to she's anxious as well, that it will threaten to take other loved ones away from her. And I think that sense of that Victorian sense of death being ever present and quite close by really shapes Maud, and then to some extent Peggy as well, because of course she's just emerged from the World War, and death again has been very much ever present.
That's why I was talking about that Peggy comes to this from her own grief.
Yes.
And is perhaps more haunted than she might be, because her life is all in disequilibrium as well.
Yes, absolutely.
As a result of what happened. You have this style, we're going to go to questions in about a minute. You have this style that is so, it's gorgeous, but it's kind of, and I say this in the nicest of, most admiring of way, it's kind of Victorian repressed. That's, it's dark, and there's a lot hidden, and there's a lot that's said and a lot that's not said. How do you think about writing that way? Is it how it had to be? Is it how it came out? Tell us about that.
Yeah. I think I think it's partly why I like writing historical, is that you can, that sort of repressed tone comes more naturally, because they weren't, neither the Victorians nor the sort of people in the 1940s were in a culture which let it all hang out, and you say whatever you want to say, you say exactly what you feel. It was much more of an oblique, especially when you were talking about sort of very emotional things, or talking about sex, or talking about anything sort of the things that we find quite easy to talk about today were not easy to talk about in either of those periods of time, I think. And I quite like writing from that point of view. Maud as a child especially is not able to grapple with those kind of subjects easily, even in her own mind. And I just find it an interesting and slightly sort of oblique way of writing about these things from that sort of repressed point of view, I think.
And we know as readers that something is left out. We know that something is actively being avoided.
Yes.
But it feels fair, because that's how someone that's how someone would actually think.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, we know it's all there. It's just that it's difficult or impossible or sort of just not, the characters are not wanting to talk about it in a straightforward way, but they're still very much circling those subjects.
Exactly. It's sort of not done, but it exists. But it
But it
exists.
exists and it's important.
When you are writing, does it affect how you deal with your world and your family, or when you go outside your office door, do you come back now?
I emerged from my office as a sort of Victorian for a little while, and after, I don't know. No, I think I tend to be able to leave it behind in a way, and then re-immerse myself in it when I go back to my desk. But having said that, I mean, it's always sort of swirling around in the back of my mind, I suppose, and at the oddest moments, you'll think of a thought in Maud's voice and have to jot it down.
That Maud is not leaving you alone.
No,
I understand that.
Yeah,
and I understand it from reading it as well. Why that would happen. You were saying that you've always been interested in books of this ilk and of this era. If someone says, "Wow, this sounds great," what are your formative books? What books do you think changed your life when it came to seeing the world this way?
Well, the book that really changed my life was Jane Eyre, which I read when I was a sort of similar age to Maud, and it really blew me away. I mean, I had loved reading before that. I was quite a bookish sort of kid, but Jane Eyre was just something else. It just took me, I don't know, it's just sort of one of those books that you read at the right time in the right place, and it just transported me completely.
Deborah was asking that same question. What were your influences? What was it about Jane Eyre, do you think?
Oh, gosh, yeah, it's just it's not just Jane Eyre, but the whole Bronte thing, the whole, the sisters writing together at their table in the parsonage, and the sort of myths that grew up around them as well as Jane Eyre itself. And I think just that Victorian milieu, and I just found it so sort of other and mysterious, and that the Gothic, the sort of frisson of fear with the secrets in the attic and the old house, and just really inspired me and made me want to write too.
No, we devour that. Absolutely. Yeah. And you've captured that in The House in the Orchard. Margaret Lang is saying, "Oh, I wore out 2 paperbacks of Jane Eyre before I found a bargain on a hardback." And Margaret in the back room is saying, "Jane Eyre fans unite, Bronte fans unite." So you've got a whole cheering section in the chat and in the comments. Oh my golly, I'm looking at the time. We should take some questions. I have seen them coming through. Mighty Blaze is saying, "Did you have to?" This is Margaret, who's hilarious. "Did you have to fight anyone for the handle?" Thanks, Ryder.
No, I didn't. And I feel a bit presumptuous having used it now, but I've got it now. So, so there it is. But yeah, it does sound a bit like I'm the only writer on the Isle of Man, but I'm not at all.
Oh, I think it's great. Renee has a perfect question. Do you live in a creepy old house?
I live in a fairly old house, but it really isn't very creepy. It's got very nice, friendly vibes actually, which I'm glad of. It dates back to about 1870. Our house. And it used to be an inn, apparently. I don't know much more about it than that, but I'm sure it's got a few stories to tell. But
oh, absolutely. Inn on the Isle of Man is where you live from more than 100 years ago. I think that probably has some history. And I love that. Is this your study that you're in?
It is, yes. This is my favorite place to write. So
our house here in Newton was built in 1894. Mm-hmm. The editor of the newspaper's house here in Newton. And our dining room is exactly the color of your study walls. So,
very nice. Yes, I painted it yellow in a few months ago. It needed a facelift, so I painted it a nice cheerful yellow, which is a good creative color, I think.
Tuscan yellow. Who else has a question? How did you keep your writing voices separate? Yes, says Margaret, and I agree with that question. Writing different voices at different times and places. So you said you did the diary first.
Yes, I did keep them. I didn't try to do a little bit of Peggy and a little bit of Maud. I very much kept them separate, and because it is a risk to sort of, you need them to be quite distinctive, because they're such different people at such different times, and it was important to keep them separate from each other, especially when hopping back and forth between them. So I sort of did my Maud bit, and then I did my Peggy bit, and made sure I was in a different zone each time.
But since you did that, you had to juggle that you knew the whole Maud story, and you had to weave in the Peggy's discovering of the Maud story. So you had to pretend, writing as Peggy, that you didn't know the end of the diary. Tell us about that. That's a tour de force.
Well, I suppose I switch off the the Maud bit and switch off the myself bit and become Peggy and see it from the whole thing afresh, and see the house and the diary itself just with fresh eyes. And it's just taking on her voice, I suppose, made it easier to do that because
you became her.
Yeah.
Reading the diary. Oh, that's the greatest. That's wonderful. And that is why it works so well. Shannon is asking, The House in the Orchard, was that always the title?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. No, the title, I played around with the title a lot, actually. My working title was Bad Apple, which was a reference to, I suppose, the orchard, of course. And Maud, I think at one point is described as a bad apple by another character, and the whole sort of reference to the fallen woman and Eve and her apple. But it was decided that wasn't necessarily quite as workable as something to do. I think Tin House wanted to bring the house into it as being an important character, and so we played around quite a lot with titles, and The House in the Orchard was settled on as describing the book well, I think.
And it takes 2 steps to get to Maud as the bad apple, from bad apple to a person who is a bad apple. And it takes no steps to get to the house from the house.
Yes, exactly.
So when you unpack it.
Yeah, I think so.
Margaret is saying, do you have a real diarist in your family? I wonder, because I started my diary when I was 11 and it's still going. Wow.
Oh, that's very impressive. Yeah,
it is.
I used to keep a teenage diary. I don't anymore. I don't know. I did keep it for quite a while, but I'm afraid I got rid of it at the end because reading it used to make me cringe so badly. Because I don't think I was quite as eloquent as Maud in my diary.
It's all about boys and being disappointed,
exactly.
Jealousy and things.
All a little bit self-absorbed, I'm afraid, mine.
But 13 and 14. What do you want? Let's take one more question, and then it's 9:00 where you are. So the perfect question to end with, Renee. Elizabeth, how did you celebrate finishing this book?
I finished it around Christmas time. Is it 2 or 3? 2 years ago it would have been. So I suppose I just threw myself into Christmas when I finished this one, because it was just, ended. I dotted the last dot on I don't know, about 21st of December 2019 or something like that.
Marvelous. I mean, talk about Christmas gifts. That's a great gift. The gift of lack of stress. The being happy that you finished your book. Well, congratulations, Joanne. A little heart for that. And we give you a big heart for The House in the Orchard, Elizabeth Brooks' new book, which is quite marvelous, as you completely heard in Elizabeth's description of the book. And it is now time to spin the wheel of fun to see who is going to win the giveaway of The House in the Orchard. This is always just so very exciting. We should hum a little tune while this happens. And the winner is Shannon Hansen. Wonderful. That's so great. Shannon Hansen. I call her Shanson from a time that I mispronounced her name. Shannon Hansen is a great fan of Crime Time and a diligent reader and a wonderful reviewer. So couldn't think of a better winner for The House in the Orchard than Shannon Hansen. And Shanson, you can email me, as you'll see in the directions, about how to get your copy from Tin House and from Elizabeth. Before I say goodbye to Elizabeth, let me just tell you that next, whatever day that is, Tuesday on Crime Time, we will have something completely different from today. We are going to host Reese Bowen with her latest Lady Georgie book, Peril in Paris. It is, It's adorable. It's hilarious. You know, Lady Georgie, she is like the 64th in line for the crown. She's never going to be queen. And she is penniless and she is adorable and newly married to Darcy. And a lot is happening in her life in Paris. Peril in Paris. Next Thursday, we will chat with the queen of us all, Reese Bowen, and I cannot wait to see you there. Today, again, Elizabeth Brooks, all the way from the Isle of Man. Thank you so much for
thank you.
the House in the Orchard. I hope you had fun.
I very much did. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege.
And fun for us too. Thank you so much. Terrific, terrific book, and all the best, all the best.
Thank you. Thanks.
And all the best to all of you too. We are so grateful that you joined us here this afternoon. Until next Tuesday, keep reading. I love you and thank you so much for coming. See you next time.